is on endless wars of imperialism. That's our topic this morning. And certainly, for the last 15 years, that's been in the 21st century, it's been very evident that we've moved from one war to the next, with the United States essentially facilitating and leveraging, if not fighting, in every single instance. Prior to that, we don't like to think about it, but the wars have gone on. The United States began with the genocide of the native population, the enslavement of Africans brought over against their will, and the conquest of Latin America in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the recovery of the African and West Asian empires from the rest of Europe since World War II. Our country has not stopped aggression for one moment in this period. And we can talk here about just the 21st century. We can say, well, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and it just goes on and on. These wars of aggression facilitated as well as fought by our country, and we really need to understand that this is the case, and Ukaine, leave me not forget, and that all this agitation is not only a horrific crime, but that it's an incredibly dangerous situation for us as well as the rest of the world. And I hope that by talking together here that it will shore up our resilience and our willingness to come out and talk to the people outside of this group who really have no idea and who, may not be terribly interested in hearing. One last comment. In 1946, my uncle, at the end of World War II, gave a speech in a mainstream venue at a college, and he said, I think we should let the United Nations, we should work together with the United Nations to enforce international law, and that all of the countries of the world should lay down their arms. And the United States being the only country really at this point which is still in good condition and still has a strong army, we should lay down our arms first. And I think the fact that he could say that in a mainstream public venue and be applauded tells you how times have changed. Because today, I think if someone went out and said that to a Republican or a Democrat convention, to a college graduating class, they'd be laughed at. So we need to somehow regain our sense of perspective and our sense of how to have a society. And we need to talk to those people who have forgotten and lost track of what's really happening in the world. So I'm going to now pass your attention to my co-chair, Lucy Pagoada.
Thank you, compañera Judy. It is a true honor to be here today at this incredible conference. And as Judy said, my name is Lucy Pagoada, and I define myself as a Honduran in resistance. Soy una hondureña en resistencia. Thank you. And of course, when we talk about the endless wars of the United States government globally, how can we not mention the endless war that the United States has held in Latin America? From the very beginning of the European brutal and assassin conquista, or the invasion through the first European who landed in the Caribbean, we've been brutalized by the imperialist endless war, and shamefully later by our very own government of the United States. But we have to remember that when there is invasion and when there is occupation and brutality, there has to be resistance. So I'm also here to talk about resistance, the same resistance that you all are doing here in the United States. So an applaud for you for being in resistance, just like the people in Latin America. How can we not talk about the resistance of Cuba, en el comandante Fidel, en el comandante Che, and today el comandante Raúl? How can we not talk about the resistance in Venezuela, en el comandante Hugo Chávez, Ecuador, Uruguay, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and of course Honduras, which a lot of times is forgotten. But we have to remember in 2009, when the brutal coup, US-led brutal coup, started the massacre of the Honduran people. But those people too rised up and are still in resistance and are still resisting the dominance of the US militarization of Honduras. So when we are here talking about the brutality of this government, we also have to talk about the courageous, incredible resistance of the people who are doing the work in their trincheras, just like we are doing here in the belly of the beast. So with that said, I want to welcome you all and I want to thank you for all that you are doing in your very own places, fighting against the injustices and the brutality of the capitalist imperialist system. And I want to welcome our first speaker. Her name is Susan Abulhawa. Susan, please come to the front. Thank you. Susan Abulhawa is a Palestinian novelist. She is a poet, activist, mother, and the founder of Playgrounds for Palestine, a children's NGO. Her debut novel, Mornings in Jenin, was an international bestseller, translated into 26 languages. Her second novel, The Blue Between Sky and Water, will be published in June. Compañeros and compañeras, brothers and sisters, let's please give a very warm welcome to our compañera and sister in struggle, Susan Abulhawa from Palestine. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here and for inviting me. I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about this morning, but I was telling my friend Betsy Piet about a story, something that happened to me recently, and she suggested I relay it to you, so I'm going to do that. It involves a popular mainstream show. I'm not going to mention what it is, but where people are invited to give a sort of 15-minute talk that presents an idea or a concept or something provocative for people to think about, and it should relate to also personal stories and personal experiences. So I wrote a piece that I was very proud of, and I sent it to her, and it was an immediate refusal. So the topic that I had written about involved, it was my reaction to this sort of pervasive thing in Western discourse that demands of Arabs and Muslims to sort of prove our humanity before we are allowed into the conversation. So you see all these talk show hosts and interviewers who always end up asking us, well, do you support blah, 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 or do you support terrorism? And so it's kind of this initial, prove yourself, prove that you are worthy to be in our company kind of discourse. And it assumes sort of a moral superiority. And so the piece that I wrote was provoked by a particular letter that I received that was signed, sincerely, the civilized Western world. And yeah, So I wrote a response. I started with a personal story that I'm going to skip, but I do want to read you some of the relevant parts that the show objected to, and they objected to it on the grounds that, first, this isn't something that the audience really is going to be particularly happy to hear. That was the first thing. When I, wrote back that I don't really think of the comfort of the audience when I'm articulating my truth, the next response that came back was, well, it's not a particularly interesting idea and it's not very unique. So I'm going to read it to you, and or at least part of it. And I framed it as a response letter. So there are phrases in there that read, "Dear Western World. Dear Western World, you have laid waste to cities across continents, terrorized and traumatized whole societies. All are still recovering from your presence in their lands. I came into the world not long after southern poplar trees dangled lifeless black bodies, where entire white Christian families would come out by the thousands to watch and cheer the spectacle of lynchings. I was born toward the end of your foray into Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the wholesale rape, wanton slaughter of innocents, and extraordinary destruction of the natural world. Following your colonial misadventures, you spared few post-colonial societies from your sense of entitlement to their resources, nor from your contempt and disrespect for their cultures. You allowed none of us to heal or develop our societies. Your endless coups, assassinations, covert and overt violence gave us no peace, no stability long enough to have our own social, scientific, cultural, or economic revolutions. Anytime we liberated ourselves or elected nationalist leaders committed to the welfare of their people, you would kill, depose, and replace them with puppet autocrats who rain terror on their people for your benefit. You did away with Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso because he advocated for self-sufficiency that threatened your hegemony in the region. You murdered Patrice Lumumba, and with him, the chance that the people of DR Congo might share in the riches of their own land. Then you sent your corporations, your miners, militias, and missionaries to oversee the bloodletting of 6 million Congolese. You murdered Salvador Allende and plunged Chile into torture and misery under your man, Pinochet. You tried your best to kill Fidel. You tried, and maybe you succeeded, in killing Hugo Chavez and Yasser Arafat. You did away with Mohammad Mossadegh too, because he insisted that Iranian oil was for the Iranian people, not you. Then you propped up the Shah to do your bidding. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was one you made in secret to divide, manipulate, and rob us in perpetuity. And when it was uncovered by the Bolsheviks, you remained unrepentant, adamant that Arab and Persian oil was there to flow cheaply to you. When the first elected leader of an independent Syria, President Shukri al-Qawtari, advocated for Arab unity and self-determination, you backed a coup to take him out, fledgling that Arab democracy in Syria in ways that reverberate and echo into the unbearable carnage that is Syria today. Osama bin Laden was your man. Saddam Hussein was your man too. You ushered him to power after you got rid of Abdul Karim Qasim, who dared to put Iraqi interests before yours. You brought Saddam to power through an orgy of killing of Iraq's intellectuals, teachers, doctors, scientists, poets, and musicians. When I was a little girl, I lived in Kuwait in an area populated with Palestinian refugees like us and poor workers from other Arab nations. In the apartment across the hall from us lived an Iraqi widow with her children. Kamal, her oldest son, was 18 years old. I was 6, and I expressed my little girl crush on him by throwing fruit peels and mango seeds at him from our window when he walked by. Everyone knew what I was up to, of course, because timing my insults required a great deal of reconnaissance and planning, but he was so good-natured about it. Kamal's life, his dreams, and future ended when he was killed in the Iran-Iraq war. You cynically armed both sides of that awful conflict, switching sides back and forth to ensure that neither got the upper hand for long enough so that the fighting and inhumanity would continue as long as possible. Kamal was one of an estimated 1 million who perished in the fog of that war. When your local Lord Saddam Hussein became too powerful and Iraqi society perhaps too educated, you engineered a way to plunge them all into an incomprehensible hell. Your sadistic sanctions alone killed 500,000 Iraqi babies under the age of 5. Some of the ones that survived your barbarity are the rank and file of ISIS now. They are the ones who grew up without education because you bombed their schools, roads, and bridges. The ones who drank the water you polluted when you systematically destroyed their water system. The ones who nursed on the depleted uranium you spread throughout their land. The ones who grew up under the thumbs of your soldiers whose merciless cruelty you are still hiding. What we saw of Abu Ghraib we know was just the tip of the iceberg. You made ISIS. ISIS is your Frankenstein, not Islam's. They are your monsters that you unleashed into our tortured cities, into societies too broken now to perform the normal functions of marginalizing extreme elements. And we still do not know how ISIS is so well trained and so well armed. You destroyed Iraq. You reduced that ancient society, that birthplace of written language and mathematics, into a cauldron of internecine violence. You looted their museums and oil fields. You did the same thing to Libya. You made beggars of mothers and teachers and doctors and produced generations of illiterates into what were high-functioning cultured societies. I'm going to skip the next personal memory, but I could go on of what you've done and, of course, what you've made of Palestine. That once multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic land is now a place of exclusivity, supremacy, and entitlement for Jews at the terrible expense of non-Jews. A place of apartheid, multi-tiered laws based on religion, color-coded IDs, segregated roads and buses, of military occupation, guard towers, snipers, sweeping surveillance, systematic state theft, constant displacement, persistent day and night raids that drag people from their jobs and schools into torture dungeons. Palestine is the birth and life place of my ancient Jerusalem family, centuries of inhabiting At-Tur, and centuries more before that of inhabiting Deir al-Hawa in Jerusalem. But none of us is allowed to live there or inherit our birthright, because in the eyes of those who hold the guns, we are the wrong kind of human. We are exiled, occupied, or languishing in refugee camps so that every Jewish person from around the world can have an extra country. The devastation you have wrought on others is breathtaking. When refugees of the infernos you stoked manage to escape, grasping at the wind for some lifeline, you let them get swallowed by the sea. Or if you let them in, you congratulate yourselves endlessly for your charity, consign them to impoverishment, and simultaneously bemoan an immigrant problem. When you had destroyed, stripped, and raped so many of everything in this world, and they had nothing but their faith to give them a modicum of solace, you openly and publicly mocked what is sacred and holy to them, ascribed the most vile filth to their prophet, and in an inconceivable arrogance, you called it free speech. The PEN American Center even called it courageous. Dear Western world, I think I should end. I'm getting the end now, but I want to thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Johnny Achi. Johnny is a Syrian-American peace activist and a founding member of Arab Americans for Syria, which is essentially a West Coast organization. He has been to Syria 7 times since the present crisis began in 2011, and he led a U.S. anti-war fact-finding delegation to Syria in September of 2013 at the height of the U.S. campaign to carry out a military strike. I remember that they went and interviewed the youth who were sitting outside the area that the U.S. had threatened to strike. So I hope Johnny's going to come up here, and I'm sure that you'll be interested in what he has to say.
Good morning. Thank you all for having me here. As been told, I'm founding member of Arab Americans for Syria, a group that we started together early on in the crisis when we realized what we were up against. We realized what's happening in Syria is not a revolution, far away from being a revolution. We realized they were trying to manufacture a revolution. We felt how the media, the vicious media campaign against Syria, not that just they're not presenting the other side of the story, but on the contrary, they were reversing the facts. Everything that was showing early on was nothing but the opposite of what's happening. Syrians have seen what happened in Iraq, we've lived it. We've seen what just had happened in Libya months earlier. We didn't want the same to happen to Syria. Syria was living its best days at the time. Yes, we wanted reforms, we supported reform. People were going in the millions in the street in support of the government reforms. Yet the media was only showing you the few hundreds that wanted to overthrow this government. They were the puppets for the United States to turn out Syria from being a resistive nation to a puppet nation. I will just briefly tell you what what's his name? Turkish General Ismail Haki, he summarized it by saying, he's the chief of staff of the Turkish army. He said, Turkey has repeatedly asked Syria upon request from the West and Washington to let the Muslim Brotherhood into the government. When Assad refused, they moved to the armed rebellion, importing armed groups, mercenaries, and terrorists from all over the world to overthrow Assad by force. The Turkish and the Qataris wanted to pass the gas lines from Qatar to Turkey. When Syria refused, of course, all hell was broken loose. Qatar and Saudi Arabia provided the propaganda early on. On Qatari TV, we heard call for jihad. We heard it in the mosques just before on Friday prayers, people asking for jihad. Jihad is a very difficult word, very dangerous word, people. When on Qatari TV, which had earned the trust of the Arabic viewers through the Palestinian crisis, when you hear in your home calling for Muslims around the world to come to Syria to fight the infidels, all Syrians have become infidels. Anybody who supports the Syrian government is an infidel. So what happened to democracy? Don't I have the right to fight or be on the side who I want to be? Suddenly, we were getting threats. All the Syrians, blood were spilled. If you were with the Syrian government, your blood is halal. Qatari Yusuf Qaradawi, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, not only provided the necessary fatwa, which is a religious decree for fighters to come into Syria, but he also asked them to join the Islamic State and to start the Sharia law in Syria. This was the most dangerous thing that the West never reported. We were fighting mercenaries from all over the world. The Syrian army was not attacking civilians. The Syrian army was protecting cities. Any place that these mercenaries did not come in is still intact. Damascus, which is the most cosmopolitan of all the cities in Syria, has a mosaic of all the religions and different ethnic groups and sectaries. It's safe, they protect each other. There is no civil war in Syria, otherwise Damascus should have been lit on fire. On the contrary, Damascus, where 5 million live, the only problem in Damascus is our friends, what the Obama administration called moderate rebels. They're the ones who rain Damascus every single day for now almost 2.5 years with rocket-propelled grenades. This is the only thing that's happening in Damascus. No one talks about it. It's the most consistent thing in this war is this rocket-propelled grenade. We've lost families from these random rockets. How is not that terror? These are the moderate rebels that Obama wants to bring in instead of the secular government that we currently have in Syria. These people who have promised us that once they get in power, they're going to slaughter us. The only thing that's preventing them from doing so is the Syrian army. The Syrian army, if it falls, if it drops, then you'll have a true genocide in Syria. You will have, if you think 100 or 200,000 have lost their lives, most of it by the Syrian army, you will have millions. You will have a true genocide in Syria. So I'm trying to tell you, these mercenaries have committed all the crimes you've heard about. I don't have time to discuss and prove to you. But all the massacres that happened on the eve of United Nations Security Council meeting, how convenient, on every eve of United Nations Security Council meeting, we'll have a massacre. The Syrian army was convicted, and then the ambassadors closed their embassies, and Syria was punished. Sanctions, and then, you're guilty party, and then this is not the pretext for war. We fought this off. Thank you to all of you. What happened in Ghouta, this bomb attack, we know whose sarin it was, right? So thanks to you, millions of emails, millions of phone calls hit the Congress, and I think this is the first time when the American public was able to stop a war for the first time ever. Thank you. We moved on. They needed to find another pretext. The next pretext was, of course, the global war on terror. Bush used it He was never tried for it, right? 1 million Iraqi killed, 40,000 American families' life dismantled by either losing their son or daughters or bringing them home. We're done? Oh man, there was so much I could tell you, but thank you. Maybe later on we'll finish it. Thank you.
So I just want to follow up on what Johnny just said and say, please, please read outside of the mainstream press on Syria, outside of the channels supporting U.S. policy, because everything that you hear there is, as he said, the opposite of the truth. So for now, we're going to move on and we're going to hear from Joel Andreas. Joel is coming up now, and he works for workers' rights and racial justice, and he's written a wonderful comic book called Addicted to War, which I hope all of you will take a look at. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to thank Sarah and Joe for inviting me to come here. This is a great event. I want to start with a proposition, and that is that sometime in the future, aerial bombardment is going to be considered a war crime. It's going to be banned by international convention. It's going to be considered beyond the pale. And that's because I'm not just talking about napalm or white phosphorus or carpet bombardment or all the other especially horrendous aspects of aerial bombardment. I'm talking about all aerial bombardment with conventional bombs, with any kind of bombs, of villages, of cities, because they kill so many civilians. This is the main reason why in the 20th century, the deaths of civilians during wars has just skyrocketed. It's because of aerial bombardment. That's the key reason. Now, when they first started dropping bombs on villages and cities from airplanes, this was during the First World War and after the First World War, it was very, very controversial. This changed during the Second World War when it became normal. You could say it became normalized, and by that I don't mean it was supported by lots of different specific conventions. I mean that it was looked upon as normal. During the Second World War, it changed. And then it became even more normal with the Korean War, with the Vietnam War, and more recently with the Gulf War, with the Afghan War, with the Iraq War. It's become a regular part of U.S. military strategy. In fact, it's become the central part of U.S. military strategy around the world. And by now, it's looked upon as normal by politicians, by the mainstream media, by diplomats, by mainstream human rights organizations. All of them see this is just a part of war. Of course, when Syria drops barrel bombs, it's called a war crime, and it is a war crime. But when the United States drops much more powerful bombs and kills many more people, or when France does, it's just looked at as a normal part of war. But this is really the main reason why so many civilians are dying in wars in the 20th and 21st century. Now, I don't know whether it'll happen in our lifetime, but it's going to happen that this is going to be looked at as a war crime and it's going to be banned. Now, how does something like this something so barbaric become normal? I think we can see this process happening today with drone warfare. There's three major innovations with drone warfare. One is that the attacking party does not have to send their own soldiers into war, so they don't have to risk their lives. And they don't have to stir up the kind of opposition that causes. The second is that it's an endless war, that it has no boundaries, that it has no boundaries in terms of time, there's no beginning, there's no end, and there's no borders. And it's justified, I guess those are two reasons. It has no borders, it has no boundaries, and it has no beginning and end. This is justified, it's been justified in several ways. It's been justified by the war on terror, which is, they suggest we have to wage war constantly with no end. It's also been justified by comparison with conventional aerial bombardment. They say, and this is true, that bombing with drones causes less civilian casualties than bombing with jets and bombers. That's true, but it can only be looked at as less civilian casualties when you compare it to the absolute huge amounts of civilian casualties that are caused by bombers and jet fighters. And it's only because those have become looked at as normal that then drones can be looked at as less barbaric. Now, the big question today is, how can we keep drone warfare and this kind of endless warfare from becoming normal? And I think that it's certainly possible to do this. We've got to work extremely hard to keep it from becoming normal, and then if it does become normal, because I don't think there's any, there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to keep it from becoming normal, we've got to constantly still fight against it, and until we can drive it from becoming normal altogether in the future. Now, that's certainly possible. One time in this country, plantation slavery was normal. There were people who opposed it at first. There were people who opposed it all the way through. For decades, abolitionists opposed it. Finally, they succeeded. We might be seeing the same thing happening right now with something else, with police murders, with police brutality. I live in Baltimore, and for the last several weeks, there's been really remarkable protests. Some peaceful, some violent, but constant protests against the killing of Freddie Gray. And it's had a tremendous effect. I think before, the Baltimore police have killed people regularly, young black men, young unarmed black men, regularly for years. And it's not only in Baltimore, it's all around the country, and this was normal. It didn't even rate headlines. Since Ferguson, that's changed. And now it's changed even further. With Ferguson, they did not indict the police. In Baltimore, they indicted them, charged them with second-degree murder and manslaughter. And the police may be losing their impunity. And it's because people saw that this was not something that we should acquiesce to and consider as normal. I think the lesson is that there were people that were fighting abolition of slavery for a long time, that were fighting against police brutality for a long time. They never gave up. We have to have the same attitude towards aerial bombardment. We have to have the same attitude towards drone warfare and endless warfare. And we have to keep it from becoming normal. And if they succeed in making it normal, we have to keep on fighting until we make it barbaric again and not normal. Thank you.
I would like to recognize the presence of the members of the May 1st Coalition's participation in this conference. If they can get up, and can we give them an applaud? As you can see, please, May 1st Coalition members, please stand up. As you can see, most of them are women. It's really interesting how this coalition, it's led by incredible, courageous women and men, most of us women. That's to say that without the women's participation, there is no revolution. Power to the women. Thank you. Our next speaker is Abayomi Azikiwe. He is the editor. Thank you, Abayomi. You can start coming up. He is the editor of the Pan-African News Wired, based in Detroit. He is an organizer with the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, MECAWI, and the Moratorium Now Coalition. Please let's welcome Abayomi Azikiwe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And the topic of this panel this morning, Endless Imperial Wars, is a very broad topic. And I want to, of course, deal with the origins of modern-day imperialism over the last 6 centuries. And I have exactly 6 minutes to cover 600 years of world history. So I'm going to get started right now. In order to fully understand the current period of imperialist rule throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and within the geographic boundaries of the European continent and North America, we must acknowledge, first of all, the role of the 15th century interventions in Africa and in other parts of the world. Beginning in 1402, the Kingdom of Castiles, a precursor to modern-day Spain, invaded the territories off the coast of North Africa, now known as the Canary Islands. This period in Southern European history represented the initiation of an expansion into Africa and Latin America, stemming from an alliance between the mercantilists and the monarchies of both Spain and Portugal. Now, this intervention into the North African islands of the Mediterranean was met with fierce resistance for nearly a century. It was not until 1495 that the rulers of Spain could claim control over the Canaries. The role of Portugal in taking control of the other islands, such as the Azores and the Cape Verde, set the stage for the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, the colonization of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands, as well as the encroachment into North America. Within the Canary Islands, as early as the latter years of the 15th century, a pattern of colonialism was established that will continue until the contemporary era. After the conquest, the Castilians imposed an economic model based on single crop production for export, first utilizing sugarcane and later wine, which was an important item of trade with Great Britain. During this period, the first exploitative structures of a colonial regime were established. Both Gran Canaria, a colony of Castile since March the 6th of 1480, and Tenerife, a Spanish colony since 1495, had separate governors, connoting the soon-to-be universal system of divide and rule. Through the conquering of the African islands, the system of the Atlantic slave trade would flourish through the 19th century, when the European rulers imposed the colonial system based on an increasing industrialized method of production and labor exploitation. By this time, most of Africa had been conquered by Europe, with the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 served to provide additional legal cover for the institutionalization of colonial rule, which was just as genocidal and socially disruptive as the system of slavery. The Atlantic slave trade and colonialism was a violent system of exploitation, which brought other European countries into the process. After the initiation by Spain and Portugal, many other burgeoning nation states in Europe became involved, including Holland, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Britain, and France. This project did not remain limited to Africa and the Western Hemisphere, but extended eastward to today's Middle East and the Pacific Islands. Both wars of the first half of the 20th century were largely based on the struggle between various European states. The waning Ottoman Empire, which collapsed during World War I, and Japan, in a ruthless campaign to conquer the world and its resources. The national liberation movements which emerged forcefully during and after World War II would reshape international politics. With the emergence of newly independent states throughout Latin America, earlier during the 19th century, and within Africa, and many parts of the Caribbean and the Asian Pacific after 1945, the imperialists developed a system of neocolonialism, where control was maintained through economic and military means, despite the granting of political independence. And I'll end right there, but thank you so much.
How's everyone feeling? I don't hear you too clearly. How's everyone feeling? Yeah, remember that we are being live streamed, so we want to make sure the world knows that we're having a great time while we do the struggle. Because our struggle is also about feeling good, because we are in resistance against our enemy. Yes? Thank you. Our next speaker is also a member of the coordinating committee of the May 1st Coalition. It is Bernadette Ellorin. Bernadette Ellorin is the current chairperson of BAYAN USA an anti-imperialist and democratic alliance of the Filipino organizations across the U.S., representing youth, women, workers, LGBT, cultural workers, and human rights activists. BAYAN USA is the oldest and largest overseas chapter of BAYAN Philippines, the main political center of the anti-imperialist movements in the Philippines. Let's welcome Bernadette Ellorin, my sister in struggle. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Before I talk about the Philippines and the Asia-Pacific region, I want to start by thanking and acknowledging the people of Ferguson and the people of Baltimore for reminding us that we are living under a police state. And as such, when we talk about endless wars, that resistance is not a choice. Resistance is a way of life. So that being said, I think the challenge for us as an anti-imperialist movement in the US is how do we support struggles for self-determination? How do we support struggles of people's resistance? Not just in name, but also in form and method. Okay, now I'm gonna go into the Philippines. So in very broad strokes, the Philippines was the first site of the first US war of aggression when the US became an imperial power back in the turn of the 20th century. And ever since then, it's been one of the original laboratories for US counterinsurgency, along with Latin America. But I'm not even gonna focus on the Philippines. I'm gonna focus on one island in the Philippines and one part of that island, and the island is Mindanao, and the part of Mindanao is Muslim Mindanao. I'm not sure if you heard, but earlier this year, there was a massacre in a town in Muslim Mindanao called Mamasapano. And the details of this operation, it was a botched counterterrorism operation to apprehend and neutralize 2 wanted terrorists who had bounties on their head, members of, they were basically Indonesian jihadists, Marwan and Usman. They were located in Mamasapano at the time. They were being, the narrative is that they were being supported by the MILF, or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And so what happened in January was that a big operation of Philippine police, special action forces of the Philippine police were deployed, not unbeknownst to the Philippine military, to apprehend these 2 individuals who were hiding out in Mamasapano. What happened was the president himself directed this operation, and the top brass of the Philippine military didn't know anything about it. So when it all fell apart and all of these people died, including members of the Philippine National Police and members of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and supposedly Marwan, one of the 2 terrorists who were targeted, there was a lot of anomalies. And it turns out, after much investigation, the president was getting his orders directly from the US military that were stationed in that region. Actually, the US has a drone center in Muslim Mindanao. And they were getting their directives from the US military personnel embedded in Camp Navarro, which is in Zamboanga City. So this speaks to the extent of how covert and extensive US counterinsurgency is, not only in Mindanao, but all over the world. And we have to recognize it as a form of war, a form of warfare, a form of low-intensity warfare, just like the police here are an instrument of low-intensity warfare here in the US. That being said, back in last year, BAYAN USA organized a peace mission to Mindanao, where we were able to talk and have dialogue with a number of Bangsamoro armed revolutionary groups about the struggle for self-determination in Mindanao. And, well, for 116 years, the Bangsamoro people, which are an oppressed national minority, have been waging an armed struggle against US imperialism, not just against US imperialism, but also against the chauvinist, US-backed Filipino government. And what we learned is that the US has been relentless in embarking on a pacification campaign, calling it a peace process, when in fact it's a pacification and divide and conquer campaign. And what we learned is that that thankfully the Bangsamoro people have not abandoned the desire to wage armed struggle. Even though in the midst of US counterinsurgency, in the midst of pacification campaign, they are still taking up arms. So I think the challenge for us as a US anti-war, anti-imperialist movement is how do we promote a counter-narrative that actually sees these people not as armed terrorist groups or bandit groups, but as freedom fighters. That's our responsibility. That is our responsibility to promote a counter-narrative of these armed groups as freedom fighters. And this is at the crux of our essence as an anti-war movement. And my time is up. Thank you very much.
Our brothers and sisters in the Philippines say, imperialismo igbagsa. Yes? All right. Imperialismo igbagsa. Igbagsa. Thank you. Gracias. Our next speaker is Glen Ford. He is the Glen. He is the executive editor of Black Agenda Report, the weekly Black Left magazine of news, commentary, and analysis, which he co-founded in 2006 with Bruce Dixon and Margaret Kimberly. A lifelong activist, Ford has worked as a broadcast and print journalist since 1970. He is the author of The Big Lie, analysis of US press coverage of the Grenada invasion. Glen Ford, Black Agenda. Please, let's welcome Glen Ford. Thank you.
Power to the people. When you've got 7 minutes, you've got to decide whether you're going to focus on a particular aspect of the subject at hand or do an overview. So I'm going to do an overview, a brief one, on endless imperial wars. Now, it is, of course, true that the period that we've entered is one of ever-escalating aggression by the US superpower and by its junior partners. They're wreaking sheer havoc and spreading untold terror upon the world. They're waging multiple wars simultaneously in what can only be described as an assault on civilization itself. So it does feel that in this juncture in history that these imperial wars will be endless. However, they will end. They will end with the defeat and the destruction of US imperialism and not before that. Ending US imperialism and ending the wars is the same thing. You can't talk about one without the other. It's important, therefore, that we assess the health of US imperialism. And if we do that, we will see that it is not in good health. In fact, it is in fatal decline. The lords of capital, and that's the class that this imperial machinery has been designed to protect, the lords of capital are also acutely aware that they are in decline globally. This is a class that creates nothing but seeks to dominate the productive capacity of the entire world, and that is the contradiction. And what they cannot dominate, they destroy, or they put under imminent threat of destruction, a kind of global coercion and extortion. They are doing a lot of destroying these days because their hold on the world is slipping, and it is slipping everywhere. They no longer even make a pretense of trying to compete with the rising centers of the actual production of things in the world, places like China and elsewhere. Instead, what they do is they try to blackmail and terrorize the planet. They try to rig and extort profits through their sole surviving advantage in the world, and that is their military power. Ultimately, even that military power cannot save them from their cascading and multiplying fatal contradictions. These are contradictions of the system itself. They have plunged the world into what seems like endless wars, a deliberately imposed kind of chaos, and they have done that because they have no other choice. So we shouldn't be intimidated, and we shouldn't be demoralized, and we shouldn't be thrown into some kind of inaction and paralysis because of the shock and awe of U.S. imperialism's vast criminality. They are ferocious these days because they know full well that the position of the European former colonial powers and of the United States is untenable. It is untenable in the long term, and it is untenable even in the shorter term. Anybody who can count can see that the productive capacity of humanity is growing beyond the control of the U.S. empire, and that becomes their crisis. The very growth of the productive capacity of the world causes a crisis for U.S. imperialism that cannot dominate it and control it. Therefore, U.S. imperialism wages various types of warfare to thwart the growing trade and connectivity of the world's peoples and the world's economies outside of imperial control and manipulation. That's why it pivots to the Pacific to present a military face to China. That's why it sponsors Nazis in the Ukraine to create a war in Europe in order to destabilize and stop the integration of Europe and Russia. They have no other choice but to resist this connectivity, to resist the furtherance of civilization itself. These wars are not going to be endless. They are only as permanent as the U.S. imperial system. A commitment to peace means a commitment to finishing off imperialism. UNAC has that commitment. They're in it for the long haul. Power to the people.
For our next speaker is Bruce Gagnon. I'll read what he said. Coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. I think of him and I always think of Keep Space for Peace. He was trained as an organizer by the United Farm Workers. He's a Vietnam-era veteran and a member of Veterans for Peace. Bruce lives in Bath, Maine, and often protests at the Bath Iron Works, where Navy destroyers are outfitted with missile defense systems. So, Bruce, I leave the stage to you.
Good morning. Neocons have successfully taken over both mainstream political parties in Washington. Obama's administration is infested with the likes of Secretary of War Ashton Carter, who wants confrontation with Russia and preventive war against North Korea, and Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, who's anti-Russian and was instrumental in toppling Ukraine's elected president just over a year ago. The neocons are reigniting Cold War hysteria. Anyone in the West that speaks out against this provocative U.S.-NATO chaos plan is Putinized in a classic replay of 1950s-style red baiting. Right after the U.S.-NATO-sponsored coup d'etat in Kiev, the neo-Nazis were sent to take similar control of Crimea after their chaotic Maidan split the country and initiated civil war. Neo-Nazi death squads have now been given official status inside of Kiev's military. This means they're getting training from the U.S. Army, who are now in Western Ukraine. So what's the plan? Continue to expand U.S. NATO bases up to the Russian border, including Ukraine. Deploy so-called missile defense systems that are key elements in Pentagon first strike attack planning. From eastern Ukraine, U.S. cruise missiles could reach beyond the Urals, where Russia's main nuclear forces are located. By 2020, when the current phase of NATO missile defense will be fully implemented, the missile defense shield, taking out Russia's retaliatory capability, could be used after the U.S. NATO first strike sword is thrust into the heart of Russia. Russia has an aging early satellite warning system and keeps its nuclear forces on launch on warning status. Thus, the chance of accidental nuclear war increases. Forget any negotiations on reductions of nuclear weapons. Russia and China repeatedly warned the U.S. that deployments of missile defense have killed nuclear disarmament talks. The overall strategy, recently spelled out in a Chicago speech by George Friedman of Stratfor, is to destabilize the Putin government internally and externally, which would create chaos and lead to regime change in Moscow. One significant method of external destabilization is the European Reassurance Initiative, signed by Obama at the cost of $985 million. These monies are for Pentagon projects that include airfield infrastructure and improvements for U.S. NATO warplanes in Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. In February, U.S. military vehicles paraded 300 yards from the Russian border in Estonia. Narva, Estonia sits 100 kilometers from St. Petersburg. In March, the battles between Ukrainian army and pro-Russian self-defense forces in the east had largely stopped, and heavy weaponry was being pulled back. The Minsk II ceasefire was then holding. At the same moment, U.S. General Philip Breedlove, the top NATO commander in Europe, spoke to the media in Washington. Putin, Breedlove said, had once again upped the ante in eastern Ukraine by sending in Russian troops. Der Spiegel reported that German leaders in Berlin were stunned. They didn't understand what Breedlove was talking about. The German government, supported by intelligence gathered from their own sources, did not share Breedlove's irrational view. The U.S. military capacity building near the Russian border illustrates the game of hardball that Washington and Brussels are playing. They're putting a loaded gun to Putin's head. The threat is being made to either submit or face expanded war and chaos, similar to what the U.S. and NATO have unleashed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and beyond. Last weekend, more than 5,000 brave citizens in Kiev protested the U.S.-backed regime's crackdown on protest leaders and journalists, many who have been killed in the last month. Organizers of the protest were reportedly arrested following the march. The U.S.-NATO proxy war in Ukraine is a trigger for a full-scale war with Russia. In the past, the peace movement has supported self-defense forces in places like El Salvador and Nicaragua. We should be doing the same today in eastern Ukraine. Thank you very much.
So, speaking of Ukraine, our next speaker is Irina Koval, who has come from Odessa, Ukraine, to speak with us. And her speech will be translated by Helena Makrusha, who came here also with some tribulation from Quebec. So let's welcome them and hear the story of Ukraine from someone who's there.
Hello, anybody. Me and my friends come here from Ukraine. В нашей стране сейчас идет война, и она приобретает ужасные формы.
There is a war going on in our country, and it takes on atrocious forms.
Когда агрессия людей приобретает самые низменные выражения.
When aggression of people takes really vile expressions, vile forms.
Желание убить доминирует над разумом и нормальными человеческими чувствами.
The desire to kill prevails over reason and normal human feelings.
Человека могут забить палками или сжечь.
A person can be beaten to death by sticks or can be set on fire.
Это значит, что наше общество деградировало настолько, что ценность человеческой жизни ничтожна.
It means that our society has degraded to the point that the human life has no value.
И от того, что это делается массово и поощряется государственной машиной, это разрушает наше понимание мироустройства.
And it's because it's done on a massive scale and it's encouraged by the state machine, it destroys our understanding of how this world is made, how it's constructed.
Чужое мнение ничтожно, и права человека массово попираются.
Somebody else's opinion does not count at all, and permissiveness and human rights are violated on a massive scale.
Гонения, аресты, обыски и политические убийства – это наша сегодняшняя реальность.
So the persecutions, the arrests, the political killings and persecutions, like I said, and arrests are encouraged, and they. Okay.
И полная вседозволенность тех, кто это делает.
And it means also that those who are doing it believe that they can do whatever they want without being punished for what they are doing.
В нашей стране набирает силу фашистский режим.
A fascist regime is taking shape in our country.
И все это делают люди, которые не чужие друг другу, и которые просто искусственно разделены пропагандой.
And all of this has been done by people who are not alien to each other. They just artificially divided by state propaganda.
Делают это ради денег и алчности своих правителей.
And they are doing it for money and for greed of people who command them, of their masters.
Я и многие мои образованные друзья ошеломлены этим.
Irina and many of her educated friends just are shocked by this. They cannot comprehend how is it possible.
Мы видим, что в Украине сейчас происходит то же, что и во многих других странах, с которыми мы солидарны.
And we see that what we're witnessing in Ukraine has been happening in other countries with which we express our solidarity.
Это те же процессы, которые происходят в Ливии, Сирии, Йемене, Палестине, Ираке, Алжире, Египте, Югославии, Венесуэле.
So the same processes that we now witness in Ukraine have been taking place in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, in Palestine, in Iraq, in Algeria, in Egypt, in former Yugoslavia, in Venezuela.
Эквадор, in other countries. Мы все жертвы империалистической войны.
We are all victims of the wars of imperialism.
Для нас важно объединиться и быть солидарными в своих действиях против ужасов этой войны.
So we believe it's very important for all of us to unite and be in solidarity in our actions against this terrible war.
И сказать громко на весь мир: стоп! Мы не хотим войны, мы не хотим убийства, мы не хотим поставок оружия в наши страны.
And we should say loudly so that the whole world hears us. We should say, stop. We don't want war and we don't want killings. We don't want weapons being delivered to our country.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Ray McGovern. Most of you know Ray from other events. He is a former Army Infantry Intelligence Officer and a CIA Analyst, having served under 7 presidents and 9 CIA directors. He was one of the senior analysts who prepared and briefed the President's daily brief. He also chaired the developments of the National Intelligence Estimates. His website is raymcgovern.com. And so here he is to, I'm sure, give some insight into events.
Thank you for inviting me. This one? Today is Victory in Europe Day. Exactly 70 years ago today was the German surrender. We drove the Nazis back out of Europe and they surrendered. And when I say we, I mean the Russians first and foremost, and then we. The parade before the Kremlin has just ended as we speak here, and the reaction of our president was to be a no-show. A supreme indignity, a supreme insult to the country that turned back the Nazis at Stalingrad and sacrificed twice as many people, killed 27 million. Can you count them? 27 million. Okay, twice as much as all the other countries involved, including Germany. A supreme insult. Why? Because the puppeteers that are taking care of our puppet President Obama, and he should be on this same shirt. They don't want peace. They want confrontation. Peace, after all, as many of you know, is bad for business. It's especially bad for the military, industrial, corporate, congressional, security services, media complex, of which Ike reminded us. So let me say a little bit about World War II here. I'm quoting from James Douglas's monumental work on the JFK assassination. It's in his introduction, and he's quoting Thomas Merton. It's not very long. I first wrote to Thomas Merton in 1961 at his monastery after reading a poem he had published in the Catholic Worker. Merton's poem was spoken by the commandant of a Nazi death camp. It was titled, quote, "Chant to be used in processions around a site with furnaces," end quote. Merton's chant proceeded matter-of-factly through the speaker's daily routine of genocide to these concluding lines, quote, "Do not think yourselves better because you burn up friends and enemies with long-range missiles." He would have added drones. "Because you burn up your friends and enemies with long-range missiles without ever seeing what you have done. Do not think yourselves better." We talk about the greatest generation. What shall we call our generation? Now, I was going to quote from that wonderful Harry, who is it? What's her name? The creator of Mother's Day, the Mother's Day Declaration, Julia Ward Howe. I will repeat just one of the sentences there. "Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, of mercy, and of patience." I was in Moscow 2 weeks ago, invited to celebrate the meeting on the Elbe, where Soviet forces and American forces finally joined 2 weeks before the end of the war. I was asked to speak, and so I chose to recite a poem. And I'd like to recite it for you here, and then translate it very quickly. The poem is called Heeding the Horrors of War, horrors being ужас. Ужас. It's almost onomatopoeia, isn't it? Внимая ужасом войны, при каждой новой жертве боя, не жаль ни друга, ни жены, не жаль ни самого Григория. Увы, утешится жена, и друга, лучший друга забудет. А где-то есть душа одна, она до гроба помнить будет. При лицемерных наших тел и всякой пошлости и прозы одни я в мире подсмотрел святые, искренние слезы, то слезы бедных матерей. Им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой ниве, как не поднят плакучей иве своих поникнувших ветвей. It means, alone in the world are sacred, sincere tears. Those are the tears of poor mothers. They don't forget their children that perish on the bloody battlefield, just as a weeping willow tree can never straighten out or lift its branches. By the Russian poet Nekrasov, who is called Poet Ruskoi Skorbi, the poet of Russian grief. I'll end now by simply saying that poem came to mind 40 years after college, when Cindy Sheehan in Dallas said, "Okay, I'm going to Crawford to ask the president what honorable cause my son was killed in." And my colleagues in Veterans for Peace and Code Pink and others said, "We're with you, Cindy. We'll go." I was there with the fire ants, and I was asked to speak. And what could I say? I recited that poem. So in closing, I'll simply say this, that there's a long tradition of honorable, gutsy, enlightened, and very well-educated women. There's Harriet Tubman, there's Fannie Lou Hamer, there's Anna Edwards that you'll be hearing from in just a minute. She's chair of the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project in Richmond. They weren't going to build a stadium on the sacred place where so many African Americans were sold into slavery. So Anna prevented that together with her husband, Phil, who's up next. Actually, I'm so proud to be male like Phil, because every now and then you'd get a male with the courage of his spouse. So Phil's next. Thank you very much for listening. Power to the people.
We are having our final speaker for this session, and after our final speaker, my compañera, my sister, Judy, will give some final announcements and final words. But before we get to our last speaker, I would also like to share something very brief about me. Besides defining myself as a Honduran resistance, I also define myself as a socialist. También soy socialista. And so we say, down with imperialism. Down with imperialism. Y en español, muerte al imperialismo. Muerte al imperialismo. Muerte al imperialismo. Long live socialism. Viva el socialismo. Y sí se puede. Thank you. It's been an honor being here with you today. You inspire me. I've learned so much. You're wonderful. And un aplauso para ustedes. An applause to all of you who are here today. Thank you. our last speaker, only for the morning, because in the afternoon we have so much more phenomenal conferences. Phil Wilayto. He is a longtime anti-war and community activist and editor of the Virginia Defender, a statewide quarterly newspaper. He is a co-founder of the Virginia People's Assembly for Jobs, Peace, and Justice, author of the In Defense of Iran, Notes from a U.S. Peace Delegation's Journey through the Islamic Republic, and a member of this conference organizing committee. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's welcome you, Phil Wilayto. Phil Wilayto. I gotta have it right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, it originally was Wilayto, but when it came out the other side of Ellis Island, it was Wilayto. So, Ray McGovern so graciously mentioned the struggle in Richmond, Virginia around Shockoe Bottom, which is not the topic of my talk, but it will be the topic of a workshop reclaiming the landscapes of Black history that Anna Edwards will be leading. And that is about a struggle that to reclaim and properly memorialize the area in Richmond, Virginia called Shockoe Bottom that at one time was the fountainhead of the U.S. domestic slave trade and an area from where the majority of African Americans today could trace some history. It's also the area targeted for a commercial baseball stadium for a second string minor baseball league by the local developers who want to make a lot of money there and don't give a rat's tail about history. And it's a good segue to my talk because that struggle is a fight for the right of the Black community to self-determination, to determine its own destiny, to define its own history, and chart its own future. And that's the same principle, one of the founding principles of the United National Anti-War Coalition, that we base our analysis of the relationship between the United States and oppressed countries around the world, including the Islamic Republic of Iran. I don't think I'm going to be able to squeeze my whole talk into the 7 minutes, and I don't want to be another older white guy who insists that his words are so golden that they must be extended. So I'm going to tell you that I've distilled the talk down from a piece that we have in the spring issue of the Virginia Defender newspaper, which is available on the Defender's literature stand, along with a lot of material about Shockoe Bottom, and also our book, In Defense of Iran, Notes from a U.S. Peace Delegation's Journey through the Islamic Republic, all proceeds of which go to support our all-volunteer newspaper. Having used up half my time, I will now make a few remarks about the topic that I'm addressing, which is the nuclear talks between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the United States, the UK, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany, which gets to take part in the talks because, after all, it's Germany. And so they're called the G5+1 countries. And the talks are a little bit off the back burner because the impression I think people have is that they're sort of went fairly well and there's going to be some kind of a reconciliation and the West may be beginning to lift some of the sanctions against Iran. And that may not be true. But I don't want to go into the details of the treaty and what's all involved and the technical aspects and so on, but I would like to point to a few things that are not being discussed very much in the headlines and in the news media accounts about it. One is that the United States is reluctantly taking part in these talks. There has been unrelenting hostility against Iran since its popular revolution in 1979 kicked out the US puppet Shah, and the Iranian people took back control of their natural resources, particularly oil, which was a tremendous blow to U.S. control in the area, and then emerged as a regional power, not so much in terms of military might, as the U.S. bases its power on, but its influence, and standing up as Cuba has stood up, and showing that you can defy the empire. Iran is not a socialist country. It has a lot of internal contradictions, but it is really nothing like we have been told it is here in this country. They have a vigorous political life. They have contested elections. Women can vote, drive, run for public office, which they cannot do in Saudi Arabia, the United States' closest ally in the region. And it hasn't fought a war in over 200 years, where the United States hasn't been at peace in over 200 years. And although every one of the G5 countries, except the G5 countries, the permanent members of the Security Council, has nuclear arsenals, they're making the center point of the talk with Iran that Iran cannot develop a nuclear weapon. The Obama administration is being forced to negotiate with Iran because Iran is the one that is stopping the extremist elements, ISIS and the Islamic State in Iraq. And it's backing off from its confrontation in order to try to get that situation settled, and then can come back and oppress Iran. The neocons in Washington, who have never accepted the fact that there is a black man in the previously all-white House, are opposing it because the only control that they can see the U.S. exerting is direct military control, where the Obama administration would like to control indirectly through coalitions and sanctions, short of war if it can do that, but is just as willing to do that. Now, to finish the rest of this talk, then I've left you on the edge of suspense and how these events will flow out. Please come to our workshop this afternoon on Iran, the nuclear talks, Iran's influence in the Middle East, and the Tehran Peace Museum, which you may have heard of. Since you have not heard of anything called the United States Peace Museum, you might be interested in the Tehran Peace Museum. And finally, I just want to thank Dair Rashid from the Defenders and Anna Edwards and all the good folks who came up with us from Norfolk and North Carolina. Dair Rashid, the Raise Up People, Black Workers for Justice, Nation of Gods and Earths, who are helping with a variety of tasks here at this conference, and we really appreciate that. Thank you.
Kaylee is going to talk to you for a moment about the journal. So please stay. This is your beautiful source of information, and I think you want to hear what she has to say. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be real brief because I know everyone wants to get to their breakout sessions. I'm Kaylee Knowles. I think about half the people in this room have gotten a nagging phone call from me, so now I have a face to put to that. I'm an organizer with People's Power Assemblies in New York City. Thanks, Imani. And I was the lead coordinator on this program journal. First, I would just like to say I'm so excited and honored to be here with you all today, strengthening and building our struggles both nationally and internationally. If you hadn't had a chance to look at this yet, this is where you can find the schedule, the breakout sections, the speaker bios are in here. There are a few really amazing articles written by members of UNAC. And there's also a form if your organization would like to join UNAC that you can fill out and return to us. But in particular, I would like to highlight that in the back of the journal, there are solidarity greetings from a bunch of organizations who help contribute to make this conference possible. As I'm sure most of you know, a conference like this takes the contributions of hundreds of individuals and groups to make it a reality. Some of those contributions are financial, some are people volunteering dozens, if not hundreds of hours of their time and resources, all to bring us all together. So I really do hope people will take the time to look through that and see some of the organizations that help make this possible. Because their financial contributions did help us make this conference financially accessible, ensure that no one would be turned away for lack of funds, to really keep this available to young people, to working people, to lower income people. And in particular, I would really especially like to thank 4 groups who took out full-page greetings. That's the Muslim Peace Coalition, the Parliament of the World's Religions, Alice Walker, and the Syrian American Forum. Thank you all so much. And I wish I had time to thank the other hundreds of people who contributed, but we would be here till dinner and no one wants that. So I would just like to end by saying thank you all so very much. And I look forward to learning from and building with you all, not only this weekend, but beyond. Thank you.
Well, while Kaylee is thanking all of us, I really want everyone here to thank Kaylee, who did an incredible, really incredible job. Hundreds of phone calls, mailings, emails, texting back and forth to everyone. It did more to really help build this conference. So thank you, Kaylee. This is a big project and hugely important. It's really made a real difference. Thank you.